Elon Musk adjusted the collar of his fraying jacket, pulling it high to shield his face from the biting winter chill. His fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the worn fabric, a far cry from the tailored suits he was used to. He stood in front of the towering Star Factory, a gleaming symbol of his empire and institution that was supposed to change the world. Today, however, it was just another massive building, filled with secrets that Elon was determined to uncover. The city around him buzzed with life, but here, in this part of town, the streets were strangely empty, a perfect setting for what he was about to do. The gray clouds overhead threatened rain, as if the skies themselves shared his unease. Elon's heart raced. His pulse thudded in his ears as he pulled his hood tighter, trying to disappear into the shadows. No one could know who he was not today, not in this disguise. Today, Elon Musk was no longer the billionaire entrepreneur who could bend the world to his will. Today, he was just another homeless man, disheveled, faceless, invisible. He wasn't an icon of tech and innovation, he was simply another soul drifting through the streets, unnoticed and unremarkable, a fly on the wall in his own empire. As he walked toward the factory gates, the weight of his decision bore down on him. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric of his jacket, chilling him to the bone. But it wasn't the cold that made his heart race, it was the fear that he might not like what he was about to find. The factory was the heart of his dream. He had built it to change the world. But lately there had been whispers. Whispers of corruption, of hidden motives, of the truth that no one wanted to face. Elon knew what he was walking into. No one inside this factory knew who he was. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, another man seeking shelter or a handout. He would be invisible, unnoticed, able to see what was really going on behind closed doors. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, his fingers slightly numb, and saw a single message from Keith, his ever-faithful driver. It read, "Are you sure about this, sir?" Elon stared at the message for a long moment. Keith had always been there for him, but today there was no turning back. This wasn't just about testing his empire's security or efficiency. This was about uncovering the truth. The people who had built the Star Factory, his trusted allies, his friends, might not be who they seemed. Elon tapped a response, typing just 2 words before sliding the phone back into his pocket, no choice. The factory loomed ahead, its steel gates dark against the dimming sky. The truth lay within, and today he would find it, no matter the cost. The factory floor was a symphony of noise, the grinding of metal against metal, the rhythmic hum of conveyor belts, and the sharp clang of tools being dropped and retrieved. Elon walked through the maze of workstations, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings, taking in the chaos and precision. Workers moved in tight formations, their focus on the tasks at hand, but there was a distance in their eyes, a lack of the spark that had once driven this place. The Star Factory had been Elon's vision, a testament to his genius, a beacon for what humanity could achieve. But now it felt as though life had been drained from it. The factory's once lustrous facade had aged, the paint peeling in places, the glass windows fogged with dust. The towering machines were meant to be marvels of engineering, designed to push the boundaries of space exploration and energy production. But now, they seemed like relics of a bygone era, their edges dulled by neglect. As Elon moved further into the factory, he kept his head down, pulling his ragged cap lower to obscure his face. To the workers, he was just another homeless wanderer, a faceless stranger in a sea of machinery. No one spared him a second glance. And that was exactly what he needed. Elon had learned a lot about the factory from afar. He had observed its operations, reviewed the numbers, and spoken to the executives and managers. Everything had seemed fine on paper. The company was meeting its targets, the prototypes were being pushed through testing, and the quarterly profits were healthy. But there were cracks in the story, cracks that couldn't be seen from the boardroom or through the lens of corporate reports. The truth, Elon realized, wasn't always in the numbers. Sometimes it was hidden in the small moments, the offhand comment, the glance that lasted a little too long, the shift in body language that couldn't quite be explained away. That's why he was here disguised as a homeless man, blending in with the factory's lowest ranks, ready to uncover what had been hidden from the outside world. He moved silently, watching as workers shuffled past, lost in their own worlds. Some were bent over assembly lines, others were hunched over control panels, making adjustments to the machines that powered the factory. There was a distinct lack of camaraderie. Where once there had been laughter and conversation, now there was only silence. The workers looked tired, disengaged. Elon's suspicion deepened. The first person he encountered in this sea of tension was Olivia. He had heard of her before. She was one of the brightest engineers at the factory. A rising star, known for her keen mind and her ability to solve some of the toughest technical challenges. Elon had always admired her work, but today there was something different about her. Olivia was standing by a workbench, adjusting the components of a new prototype for the factory's next-generation solar panel. It was meant to be a breakthrough, something that could drastically reduce the cost of solar energy and revolutionize the industry. The project had been under her care, and she had been one of the engineers Elon had trusted to make the vision a reality. But as he observed her, Elon noticed a subtle unease in her movements. She was fidgeting with the tools in her hands, as though distracted by some inner turmoil. Every few seconds, her eyes darted toward the other workers around her, as if she were expecting someone to show up at any moment. Elon, he reminded himself, his thoughts racing. No, not Elon, just a man in a hood. He approached her slowly, trying to remain unnoticed as he sidestepped the bustling activity around him. When he was close enough, he cleared his throat quietly, just loud enough to break through the noise of the factory. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice raspy from the cold air outside and the strain of his disguise. Olivia spun around, startled, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, there was something in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a forced, nervous smile. I'm fine," she said, stumbling over her words. "Just making sure the system checks are running properly." Elon studied her carefully. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the wires, and there was a tightness to her smile that didn't match the calm she was trying to project. She seemed anxious, as if she was on edge, constantly worried about being discovered or watched. Elon didn't push. He nodded and moved on, but his thoughts lingered on her. What was she hiding? By the time the workday drew to a close, Elon had seen enough. The factory wasn't just running at suboptimal levels, it was barely functioning. Machines that should have been operating smoothly were glitching, sparks flying where they shouldn't. A critical part of the solar panel prototype was misaligned, and several of the workers looked more confused than competent. But it wasn't just the technical issues that concerned Elon. It was the unrest that seemed to grow by the hour. The workers, who had once been passionate about their roles in pushing humanity's boundaries, now moved with a sense of resignation. There were no discussions of grand ideas or visionary plans. Instead, there were murmurs about layoffs and missed deadlines. Elon couldn't shake the feeling that something much deeper was at play. The whispers of corruption were faint but unmistakable, like a current beneath the surface of a calm river. The factory wasn't just struggling, it was on the brink of collapse. As he moved through the factory floor, he overheard more conversations. The workers spoke in low voices, huddling together during breaks, sharing their frustrations. "First, they cut the bonuses," one worker muttered, leaning against a wall, his face drawn. "Then the raises were delayed. And now? Now they're talking about cutting jobs too." Another worker nodded, shaking his head. "The management doesn't care. They're just in it for the profits. We're the ones doing all the work, but we get nothing in return." Elon paused, listening intently. Layoffs? That wasn't supposed to happen. This factory was the cornerstone of his vision. It was supposed to be a place where innovation thrived, where the workers were empowered and inspired by their roles. If things were really this bad, it meant that the factory had become a shell of what it was meant to be. And worse, it meant that someone was failing in a critical leadership role. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of a door slamming open. A man in a suit walked through the factory floor, his presence immediately commanding attention. It was Mr. Gregory Stone, the factory's operations manager, one of the men Elon had entrusted with the day-to-day operations of the plant. Stone was tall, his sharp suit and pristine tie standing in stark contrast to the dust and grime that covered everything around him. He moved with an air of authority, but there was something unsettling about his posture, something robotic in his every step. His face was impassive, devoid of emotion as he scanned the workers. The workers froze when they saw him, and a tense silence spread across the room. For a moment, Elon wondered if the man could sense the growing resentment in the air, but Stone didn't seem to acknowledge it. He was used to this environment, the tension, the discomfort, the distrust. To him, it was just part of the job. Elon stood back, watching the scene unfold. This wasn't the first time Stone had been seen walking through the factory, but the lack of engagement with the workers was telling. Stone had been at the factory for years, and he knew exactly what was going on behind the scenes. Yet there he was, walking around as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was running perfectly. But Elon wasn't fooled. Stone's cold detachment spoke volumes. The murmurs grew louder as Stone passed through the crowd. Workers exchanged looks, some rolling their eyes, others clenching their jaws in silent frustration. Elon caught a few words. "He's been cutting corners," one worker whispered, barely audibly. "No one's happy with him." This only deepened Elon's suspicions. Who was Stone working for? The man continued walking, oblivious to the growing tension around him. But Elon couldn't ignore it. There was something in his demeanor, something in the way he carried himself, that suggested he knew exactly what was happening at the factory. And worse, he seemed to be turning a blind eye to it. The factory buzzed with an electric tension as the hours passed. Each corner of the building seemed to hum with machinery, a constant mechanical pulse that mirrored the unease creeping through the air. Elon had spent the past 2 days slipping between the shadows, playing the part of the down-and-out drifter who had stumbled onto the factory floor by mistake. He had been careful, calculating each move, each interaction, as he gathered fragments of what was wrong with the company he had built. But as he walked the floors today, something felt different, darker, heavier, as though the very air in the factory had thickened with secrets. Elon wasn't naive. He knew what he was looking for. The broken promises, the inefficiencies, the signs of internal decay. But what he found in the factory today went far beyond what he expected. It was nearing the end of the second day when he finally stumbled upon something that would shatter his world. At first, it was just a faint murmur, low voices echoing in a small, unmarked office tucked away in the back. Elon, as usual, moved quietly through the factory, sticking to the periphery, avoiding the gaze of the few workers still milling around. He had learned by now how to blend in, how to disappear in plain sight. But this time he couldn't resist following the sounds, letting the quiet whispers pull him deeper into the heart of the building. Olivia, the young engineer, had walked past him only moments earlier, heading toward the back offices, her face flushed and anxious. She seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder more than once, as though expecting someone or something to be watching her. Elon had been meaning to speak with her again, to get more out of her, but the intensity of her demeanor today made him reconsider. He had learned something important over the past 2 days. There was more beneath the surface, more hidden under the smooth veneer of progress. But today it wasn't Olivia who would give him the answers. It was the conversation that filtered through the cracks in the office door that would change everything. Elon pressed his back against the wall, leaning close to the door to hear more clearly. His breath was steady, his pulse quickening. Inside he could hear 2 voices, low, tense, but unmistakably familiar, Victor and Richard, the senior managers who had been overseeing operations for years. Both had been key players in his rise, instrumental in the expansion of the factory. Elon knew them by reputation more than anything else. They had never given him a reason to doubt them before. But now, "You need to fix this," Richard Victor's voice growled, the tension palpable. "We can't afford any more mistakes. The investors are getting restless, and if we don't hit these quotas, we're finished." Elon's stomach tightened. The words sent a jolt of recognition through him. He had heard these kinds of conversations before, times when targets and quotas eclipsed the well-being of employees, when the pressure to perform was enough to crush everything else. But what struck him was the way Victor's voice trembled with anxiety, something Elon hadn't expected from someone in his position. Richard's reply was more measured, almost apologetic, though there was an unmistakable edge to his words. "I'm working on it, okay? The new prototype is almost ready, but we can't push the workers any harder. They're already at their limit." The vulnerability in Richard's tone was enough to make Elon pause. Richard was a man who thrived on control, on pushing people to their breaking point. It was clear that the stakes were higher than they had ever been, and yet Richard seemed to be resisting the very forces that had made him the success he was today. The tension in the conversation was escalating, and Elon felt an intense need to understand why. The air seemed to thicken around him as Victor's next words came through the door with chilling precision. "I don't care about the workers," he hissed. "I care about the numbers. We need this factory to keep running, even if it means cutting corners. You get me?" A sinking feeling settled in Elon's chest. The factory, the future of everything he had worked for, was not just struggling. It was being sabotaged from within, all for the sake of a few bottom lines, a few investors whose names he would never remember. Victor, the man he had entrusted with the future of this company, didn't care about the people who worked for him. They were simply obstacles to be overcome, nothing more. The weight of Victor's words pressed against Elon like a physical force. Everything he had built, the hours, the years, the idealism, was being treated like a commodity. The people who made the factory run, who gave it life and meaning, were nothing more than expendable pieces in a high-stakes game of profit and loss. Richard's voice followed, now tinged with fear. "But Victor, we're talking about the people who built this place," he pleaded. "If we keep pushing them, they'll break. You're asking for too much." For a moment there was silence. Elon's mind raced, his breath shallow, as he wondered if Richard would stand up to Victor, would stand up for the workers. But the silence didn't last. When Victor spoke again, there was no trace of compassion, just cold, calculated indifference. "Then they can leave. They're replaceable," Victor said, his voice void of empathy. "The system is bigger than they are. If they break, we'll find others. There's always a line of people ready to take their place." Elon's head swam. The cruelty of Victor's words left him reeling. It was one thing to hear of layoffs, budget cuts, and restructuring. It was another to hear it spoken with such blatant disregard for human life, for the people who had given their all to this place, to this dream. To hear a man like Victor dismiss it all as if their struggles were nothing but collateral damage in a corporate war. The door creaked slightly as Victor moved, and Elon snapped back to attention, his heart racing. He quickly sidestepped, ducking out of view, and pressed his back against the wall. His fingers tingled with adrenaline, but he didn't dare move. He couldn't afford to be discovered now. The conversation had confirmed everything he feared, and yet it had opened up an entirely new question. How far did this go? How many more people were involved? How many more decisions were being made behind closed doors, hidden from the very people who made this factory run? There was another movement inside the office, the shuffle of footsteps. Elon risked a glance. He saw Richard exiting the room, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had no idea that Elon was only a few feet away, hiding in the shadows, watching the entire scene unfold. Elon's mind raced. There was no turning back now. The factory was being systematically destroyed from within, and its fate was sealed in the hands of men like Victor, men who only saw workers as tools to be used until they broke. Elon's fingers clenched into fists, the weight of his decision pressing on him. This factory, this empire, was his to save or destroy. The truth had finally found its voice, and it was ugly. The workers, the heart of this company, had been sacrificed in favor of profit margins. And now it was up to Elon to expose the rot at the center of his creation or risk losing everything. Elon's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he left the office, the words he had overheard still echoing in his ears. His heart pounded in his chest, but his feet moved automatically, carrying him down the sterile, dimly lit hallways of the factory. The cold, mechanical hum of the machines around him felt almost suffocating now. The factory, his creation, was no longer just a place of innovation. It was a ticking time bomb, one that could implode at any moment. And all the while, he had been blind to its rot. He had built this empire on trust in his employees, trust in the technology, and trust in the dream he had cultivated. But now, as he walked among the factory's workers, he realized how little trust he had actually placed in the people who had made his vision a reality. How many corners had been cut? How many small compromises had been made in the pursuit of perfection? The answers were all around him, hidden in plain sight, and the deeper he looked, the uglier the truth became. Elon felt an overwhelming urge to confront Victor and Richard immediately, to walk straight into their offices and demand answers. But the stakes were far higher than just his personal dissatisfaction. He had already overheard their confession, now he had to make a choice. Confront them directly, risk exposing himself, and lose everything, or stay silent, continue to play the part of the down-and-out homeless man, and let the factory slip further into decay. The weight of that decision hung on him like a lead weight, crushing the air from his lungs. His pace quickened as he moved through the factory, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. If he exposed himself to Victor and Richard, would they believe him? Would they even care? Worse, would they see him as a threat and remove him from the equation entirely? His name was too well known, too much of a liability. He had to keep his identity hidden, for now he had to play the part, even if it made him sick to his stomach. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice. It was Olivia, standing at the end of the corridor, her eyes wide as she looked at him. For a moment, he froze, wondering if she had recognized him. But no, she seemed just as confused as he was. She looked around quickly, her gaze darting nervously between Elon and the workers nearby. "Hey," she called, her voice hushed but urgent. "You need to get out of here." Elon's heart skipped a beat. Olivia was one of the few who had been willing to speak with him, even if only briefly. She knew something was wrong, he could tell that much. But this felt different. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "Why?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "What's going on?" Olivia hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending. They're tightening the screws, Elon. The workers. They're getting restless. If you're still planning on doing whatever it is you're doing here, you need to move quickly. Victor and Richard, they're not the only ones who know what's happening. There are others." She took a deep breath. "Others who would do anything to protect the system that's in place. Even if it means making sure people like you, people who don't fit the narrative, disappear." Elon felt his pulse quicken. He could feel the walls closing in on him. There was no longer any time to hide. The factory was becoming a prison, and the people in charge were the wardens. He stared at Olivia, searching her face for any sign of ulterior motives. Was she trying to warn him? Or was she trying to push him further into danger? He couldn't tell, but one thing was certain: he had no more time to waste. The factory, this entire experiment, was slipping out of control, and it was up to him to take action. He had built this empire, and it was up to him to tear it down if necessary, or rebuild it from the ground up. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice rough with the weight of the decision. Olivia glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the hallway nervously. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I think I know where the real problems are, Elon. I've seen some of the reports, heard the whispers. There's something bigger going on here than just bad management. And if you're planning on taking on Victor and Richard, you'll need to be careful. The system has its claws everywhere." Elon's heart pounded as he processed her words. The system has its claws everywhere. It was a chilling thought, one that mirrored his growing suspicion that the corruption ran far deeper than he had initially realized. He had been so focused on the factory's decline, on the betrayals he had witnessed firsthand, that he hadn't stopped to consider how widespread the rot was. Olivia continued, her voice trembling with urgency. "There's a meeting in a few hours. The board of directors, Victor, Richard, the investors, they'll all be there. It's where they'll decide the future of this place. If you want to stop them, you'll need to be there too." Elon's thoughts whirled. This was the chance he had been waiting for. The opportunity to expose the full extent of the corruption, to take down the men responsible for the factory's collapse before they could bury the truth for good. But there was a risk, a great one. If he showed up at that meeting, if he confronted them directly, there would be no going back. The factory would know who he was, and everything he had worked for would be on the line. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest. He could feel the eyes of the workers on him as he passed through the factory, their stares a silent reminder that they too were waiting for a savior. They didn't know who he was, but they had all seen the cracks in the system. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how to fix it. Elon made his decision. He had come too far to turn back now. It was time to confront the men at the top, to take the fight to them. As he walked toward the door of the boardroom, his heart raced. His mind swirled with thoughts of what was about to unfold. The moment of truth was finally here. He pushed open the door. Inside, the tension in the room was palpable. The faces of the board members, of Victor, Richard, and the investors, were all set in hard lines of concentration. Elon knew they were already planning their next move, already calculating how they would continue to pull the strings of the factory, how they would continue to profit from the suffering of the workers. Victor glanced up at him as he entered, a sharp glint of recognition flashing in his eyes before he masked it with a polite smile. "Ah, I see we have a new face in the room," Victor said smoothly. "What can I do for you?" Elon stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had learned. "You can start by explaining why you're destroying everything I've worked for. A silence fell over the room. Richard stiffened, his face pale. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. Victor, ever the diplomat, leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying," he said, his voice smooth but laced with underlying tension. "I'm implying that you've turned this factory into a factory of lies," Elon said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "You've betrayed everyone who's ever believed in this place, and I know what you've been doing. Cutting corners, pushing the workers past their limits, all for profit, all to protect your interests. And I'm done." There was no turning back now. The door to the office swung open, and Elon Musk stepped into the room where Victor and Richard sat, their eyes flickering to him with a mix of surprise, realization, and the first traces of panic. For the past few days, he had walked the factory floor as a stranger, hiding behind the disguise of homelessness, but now the time for pretense was over. His empire had betrayed him, and today he would make them face the consequences of their actions. There was no turning back. The room fell silent. The hum of machines and the soft murmur of voices outside the door seemed to fade as the tension between them thickened. The weight of the conversation, the confrontation that had been building ever since he overheard Victor and Richard's discussion, hung in the air. Victor was the first to speak. His sharp features twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, look who decided to show up." There was an edge to his voice, an attempt to regain control of a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his grasp. Elon stood tall, no longer hiding the power that had once defined him. His eyes locked onto Victor's, and for the first time in years he felt something stirring deep inside him, a clarity of purpose. "What have you done?" Elon's voice rang out, calm but full of authority, piercing the silence like a blade. He knew what they had done. He knew the lies, the corruption, the shortcuts they had taken. But now it was time for them to hear it from him. Victor's eyes widened in recognition. The mask of control slipped for a moment. He glanced at Richard, who sat frozen, his hands trembling as he clutched the papers in front of him. For a long moment there was nothing but stillness. Then Richard, unable to remain silent any longer, spoke up. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. There was fear in his tone, a desperation that Elon had not expected. "We had no choice. The pressure was unbearable. The investors, if we didn't deliver the factory, the whole company would have collapsed. It was all falling apart, and we did what we had to do to survive." Elon's heart thudded, but his gaze never wavered. Richard's explanation was nothing but a weak excuse. His words were those of a man trying to justify the betrayal, trying to soften the blow of the truth. "No," Elon said, his voice hardening, each word filled with the weight of everything he had discovered. "You did what you wanted to do. You sacrificed everything, the workers, the future, all for your own gain. You cut corners, you exploited people, and you played with lives because you were too afraid to face the reality of what was happening." Victor stood up now, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The facade of confidence had completely dissolved, replaced with raw anger. "You think this is easy, Elon? You think this was some kind of choice for us? Do you have any idea what's at stake? You've been living in your ivory tower, detached from reality, while we've been out here, doing the dirty work to keep everything afloat. You want to talk about sacrifice? We sacrificed our integrity, our principles, and we did it for you." His voice shook with emotion, but beneath it was a cold edge of bitterness. Elon could feel the heat of his own anger rising. "You think I don't know what it's like to carry that weight?" he snapped, his voice low but filled with fire. "I've carried the weight of this company for years, but unlike you, I never sacrificed the people who made it possible. This factory, these workers, they are not expendable. They are the heart of this. And you took that heart and threw it aside to line your pockets." Victor's eyes darkened. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight. For a moment, Elon wondered if the man might strike him. But instead, Victor took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're the only one who's ever had to make tough decisions? That you're the only one who's ever had to carry this weight? You built this empire, but you built it on false promises. You made us believe we were changing the world, that we were going to be part of something bigger. But when it came down to it, you turned your back on us. You weren't here when we needed you. You weren't here when the factory was crumbling, when the workers were at their breaking point. You're not the man you think you are." Elon's chest tightened. It was the truth, and it was a bitter one. He had always prided himself on being a visionary, on being the man who could see the future, who could lead others toward it. But in that moment, standing in that room with the men who had been his closest allies, he realized how much he had neglected the present, how much he had allowed the cracks to form, to grow, to fester. He had turned a blind eye to the people who had trusted him the most. But that was over. He couldn't change the past, but he could change what happened next. "I may not have been here when you needed me, Victor, but I'm here now," Elon said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet resolve. "And you're going to have to answer for what you've done. You've betrayed everything we built. You've betrayed the people who believed in this vision, and you've betrayed the workers who gave everything for it." Victor's face twisted with fury, but Elon didn't flinch. He had heard enough of their excuses, enough of their lies. "You're wrong about one thing," Elon continued, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about me. It's not about my vision or my empire. It's about the people you've hurt. It's about the future, the one you've destroyed, just so you could keep your job, your money, your power. But it ends now." Victor's anger shifted into something darker, something more calculating. He stepped closer to Elon, his eyes narrowing. "And what are you going to do about it? You think you can just come in here and undo everything I've worked for? You think you can fix what's already broken? You're just a man. You have no power here. Not anymore." The words stung, but Elon held his ground. This wasn't just about power, it was about redemption. It was about saving what was left of the factory, the workers, and the dream he had once believed in. "You're wrong," Elon said, his voice firm. "I do have power, and I have something you'll never have. The truth." At that moment, the door swung open, and Olivia stepped into the room. Her face was pale, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that matched Elon's. Behind her, the sounds of the factory had all but disappeared, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment of reckoning. Olivia stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "He's right," she said, looking directly at Victor and Richard. "You've sold us out. You've sold out everything that was supposed to make this company different. The workers, the technology, the dream, it's all gone. But it doesn't have to end this way. We can still fix it. Together." For a moment there was nothing but silence. Elon watched Victor and Richard's faces twist into masks of frustration, desperation, and fear. "You really think you can fix this?" Victor spat, his voice bitter with rage. "You think the workers will just forget? You think they'll forgive us? This isn't a fairy tale, Elon." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Elon replied, his voice low but resolute. "But I am asking for justice, and that starts with you." He turned to Olivia, who nodded in agreement. Together they had the proof, the reports, the documents, the testimony of the workers who had been silenced. And it was time for Victor and Richard to face the truth. The factory loomed in front of Elon as the early morning light filtered through the clouded sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The hum of machinery had faded, replaced by the soft murmurs of workers milling about, unsure of what would come next. The tension that had once thickened the air like smoke had dissipated, leaving behind an uncertain calm. Elon stood on the edge of the factory lot, watching as the workers slowly gathered. They had been through so much months of rumors, whispers, and threats. They had been the invisible force behind the machines, the ones who had sacrificed so much, all while their futures hung by a thread. They didn't know the full story yet. But they would. They would know the truth. They would know what had really happened in the heart of the factory, and why everything had fallen apart. It was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. He had spent the last few days ensuring that the documents were secured proof of the corruption, the mismanagement, the lies that had almost destroyed everything. He had made the calls, had the meetings, and now the future of the factory, and of those who had worked so tirelessly to keep it running, was in motion. There was still work to be done, of course, and the road ahead was anything but easy, but it was a beginning. The factory would be rebuilt. The question was, could trust ever be rebuilt along with it? Elon's gaze flickered over to Olivia, who was standing a few paces away from him. She looked different, now stronger, more resolute. The same woman who had once hidden behind her nervous energy now stood as one of the few who had the courage to expose the rot within the walls. He had not expected her to be the one who would lead the charge. But here she was, at the forefront of the recovery, standing beside him as a symbol of what could still be saved. "You know," Elon said quietly, his voice carrying in the still morning air, "I used to think I understood everything about running a company. I thought that all it took was vision, strategy, and relentless drive. But this," he gestured to the workers gathered in small clusters around the lot, "this is what really matters." Olivia nodded but didn't speak right away. Her eyes scanned the workers, some of whom had been with the factory since its inception, others newer to the team. Each one was a cog in the machine, but it wasn't the machinery that mattered now. It was the people. "You've learned a hard lesson," Olivia said softly. "And you're not the only one. We all thought we were doing what was best for the company. But now we all know better. It's about more than just the numbers. It's about people, about trust. And it's going to take time to earn that back." Elon watched her, a deep sense of gratitude swelling within him. She was right, of course. This factory, this empire, was never meant to be built on blind ambition or unchecked greed. It was meant to be a place where innovation met compassion, where technology could be used to elevate lives, not exploit them. But in chasing his dream, he had lost sight of that truth. And now he was paying the price. He sighed and turned his attention back to the workers, who were starting to gather in small groups near the entrance. They were watching him now, some with wariness, others with hope, and still others with a deep, quiet resignation. They had been betrayed once. Would they trust him again? He couldn't say for sure. But he had to try. "I'm going to fix this," Elon said, more to himself than to Olivia. "I'll make sure it's right. I'll make sure we have the resources we need. No one here will go unnoticed again. No one will be left behind." He could feel the weight of his words pressing down on him. This wasn't just about money or technology anymore. It was about something far deeper, a responsibility that he hadn't fully understood until now. He wasn't just the owner of a factory or the face of a corporation. He was the steward of the lives of these people. Their futures were intertwined with his, whether he liked it or not. And that was the burden he now carried. "I believe you," Olivia said after a long pause, her voice steady and sure. "But it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot more than just words. They need to see action. They need to see you make things right." "I know," Elon replied, his eyes drifting back to the workers. "But it starts now, today, and I won't stop until we've rebuilt what was broken." As the workers began to filter in, taking their places on the factory floor, Elon could feel the weight of their gazes on him. Some were hopeful, others wary. It would take time for trust to be restored. But the first steps had been taken. The factory would be rebuilt, but this time it wouldn't be just a place of work, it would be a community. And Elon was going to make sure that the community knew it was valued. Hours passed in a blur as Elon worked tirelessly alongside Olivia and a handful of trusted employees to reorganize the factory, putting in place new systems, new checks, and new values. He had learned something invaluable: no empire could survive without a foundation of trust. Without that, the strongest buildings would crumble. It wasn't enough to have cutting-edge technology or visionary goals. If he couldn't create a company culture where people felt seen, heard, and valued, then all of it, every ambitious dream, was for nothing. The hours felt long, but they were filled with purpose. The factory, once a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, was now becoming a beacon of hope. Elon watched as the workers began to return to their tasks, this time with a new sense of purpose. The machines hummed more steadily, the energy was different, the atmosphere lighter. But amidst all the progress, there was one lingering question that stayed with him: what happens now? Elon had taken the first steps toward repairing what had been broken, but the road ahead was uncertain. There was no guarantee that the trust he was rebuilding would last. There was no guarantee that the damage could ever truly be undone. And yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt something that had eluded him for years: hope. It wasn't about the billions he had made or the projects he was leading. It wasn't about being right or being the smartest in the room. It was about people. About the human connections that formed the true backbone of any great company. Elon stood alone on the factory floor, watching as the workers got to work. They weren't looking at him anymore with suspicion or resentment. There was a quiet understanding in the air, an unspoken agreement that things were changing. Slowly, but surely, things were changing. But in that moment, Elon realized something profound. The question he had asked himself earlier, what happens now, was the wrong question. The real question was, what do we do with this second chance? The answer, as simple as it seemed, was one that would guide him through the years to come. Elon wasn't sure of all the answers yet, but he knew this rebuilding the factory was just the beginning. Rebuilding trust would take time, patience, and a deep commitment to doing better. But it was a commitment he was willing to make. He had lost something: his sense of control, his blind faith in his own vision, but he had gained something much more valuable. He had gained perspective. He had gained humility. And, most importantly, he had gained the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance for redemption. Elon walked through the factory's gates as the day began to fade into night. The workers were still at their posts, still hard at work. But the atmosphere had shifted. They weren't just working for a paycheck anymore. They were working for something bigger. They were working for a future that could still be saved. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Elon smiled. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years he felt like he might just be ready to face it.